Hello, everybody. My name is Evan Carr. This is my final project. I chose to do a little bit of a career overview in terms of Toni Morrison's career. This is her editing portion of her career, which I believe is actually pretty important, especially in establishing her in the literary space. So let's go ahead and get started. Toni Morrison as an author. This is important in establishing the overall context of who Toni Morrison was. So, Toni Morrison is perhaps best known in the world of literature for her work as an author. Her ability to create extraordinarily complex and effective narratives saw her rise to fame with 1987's worldwide smash Beloved. In Beloved, Morrison demonstrates just how complex the slave narrative can be. Her formation of African American identity in Beloved is perhaps one of the most intriguing things about the novel as a whole. For the duration of her career, Morrison used her writing to craft nuanced characters that worked to break the color barrier in literature. Toni Morrison may have been writing about black people, but the novels weren't strictly for black people to read. I've come to the personal observation that her work serves the purpose of educating anyone who is willing to listen with an open mind and an open heart. Sorry about that. The lessons and stories are endless in the gamut of her work. I've read Sula and I've read The Bluest Eye as well as Beloved, and there's so much that you can take from each individual novel, but you will find in reading her literature that some of the messages that she's trying to convey, especially the the message about just how important stories and interwoven narratives are, you'll find them across the gamut of her work. Roots, joining the workforce. So before becoming a full-time writer and before becoming a publisher, Toni Morrison worked as an educator, teaching college courses at two different institutions. This is important in establishing her background and maybe why she wanted to go into publishing in the first place. So this excerpt from her biographical entry on Gale Literature, Contemporary Authors, places her as a professor at two different schools before she started her career as a publisher. Texas Southern University, Houston, Texas, instructor in English, 1955 to 57, and Howard University, Washington, D.C., instructor in English, 1957 to 64. So, moving on up, Morrison makes her foray into editing. In 1965, Toni Morrison accepted a job at Random House Publishing, a massive publishing house that had its tendrils extended into every submarket of the literal sphere at this point. After seeing an ad in the paper, Morrison applied for the job because she met the qualifications. She packed up her things and headed to New York. Her job wasn't at the main headquarters in New York, though. Instead, Toni accepted a job in a smaller market first, as denoted by this quotation. She began working as an editor for a textbook subsidiary of Random House in Syracuse, New York, in 1966, and a few years later, in 1968, obtained an editorial position at Random House in New York City. So the distance from Syracuse to New York City actually is quite far, and as you'll see in a later slide, this is actually when Toni began working on her first novel that she would have published. Toni Morrison, editor. Toni Morrison is well known for having worked alongside many famous public figures throughout her time as an editor. Morrison is noted to have worked with both Muhammad Ali and Angela Davis and is considered instrumental in the publishing of their autobiographies. Toni didn't just work alongside famous people or help them write their autobiographies, though. She worked with notable African American authors who would later become her contemporaries. Morrison is noted to have worked on the fiction of such African American authors as Tony Cade Bambara, Henry Dumas, and Gale Jones. So you may be asking, why does this matter? Well, there's a lot that I could say that can answer that question. One, I think her work as an editor is very impressive. Two, I think it provides an interesting basis for her literary career, as I said earlier. This aspect of Toni Morrison's career is often overlooked, just like the educational aspect of her career is overlooked. This was Toni Morrison's first real foray into the world of literature, and I think it's important in defining her overarching time spent in the literal sphere. Toni Morrison was so talented that she was able to craft her own work while she was publishing the novels of others and raising two children on her own. This aspect of her career shouldn't be overlooked because she made meaningful contributions to literature as an editor as well as an author. The editors are far too often overlooked, and Morrison should be lauded for the grand scope of her career instead of just her writing. Learning the ways of the trade. Morrison was, by all accounts, a good textbook editor. That was what she started off doing first. However, she did find some of the aspects of the work daunting because of the truths that must be hidden. In an interview with Gail Feldman, Toni Morrison shared some of her realizations about textbook editing. Quote, some of the other things Morrison recalled learning while working on those books, that certain lines from some well-respected authors were never printed to avoid political, religious, or sexual controversy, and that there were other restrictions to which editors had to submit. Textbooks, she concluded, are a time bomb in every country. This is an interesting thing to note, and actually a really loaded quote. There's a lot that I could discuss there. If I had more time, I would discuss some of my personal feelings about that. But anyway, it's an interesting thing to note because those feelings that Morrison harbored about editing would eventually become part of why her writing was so good. The fact that she mustn't submit under any circumstance whatsoever is what makes her authorial style so distinctively powerful and effective. Publishing in New York City. In 1968, like we discussed before, Toni Morrison headed to New York City to work for the main branch of Random House Publishing. This came after news that L.W. Singer would be sold after suffering financial hardships. L.W. Singer is the subsidiary of Random House that she was working for in Syracuse. So this quote, before then, the decision was made to move certain anthology series to Random House's reference division in New York City. Morrison had realized early that some people would go with these series and wanted to be among them. In 1968, she was. It was at this point that Morrison began to wrap production on a book she had started in Syracuse. She felt that she could never show it to the people at Random House because there would be a conflict of interest, so she took it to Holt, and The Bluest Eye was published in 1970. After coworkers saw her work, there was buzz. Tony Schulte went to see her and asked her, "Wouldn't you like to be a trade editor? You can talk to Knopf and Random House." Knowing that Random House had many interesting projects for her to work on, she took up the offer. Later, she was installed as the first African-American editor at Random House. She was female as well, so it was really revolutionary. And she was given excellent opportunities to work with megalithic icons of the time like Muhammad Ali and Angela Davis. Once she went to talk to Knopf, though, she was given some interesting feedback. Bob Gottlieb, recently installed as Knopf head, told her, "I'd rather be your editor than your boss." So in the end, that is what happened. Morrison went to work at Random House, and Gottlieb became her editor. Editor and writer. Morrison would work for a long time while as an editor, while she taught and wrote to support herself and her two boys. She continued to release her own works and eased off slowly on her editing, feeling as if it wasn't fulfilling. 3 years later, after Morrison published Song of Solomon, Bernstein, whom she said was a good boss for me, asked, "If you had it like you wanted, what would it be?" He agreed to let her come in only 1 day per week. A half dozen years passed that way, but she became less interested in being in publishing, feeling that the work I liked was less and less valued. The end of the road. In 1984, Toni Morrison's career as an editor came to an end. She would give up the trade in order to focus more on her writing. In 1984, with Gottlieb's encouragement to just be a writer, she gave up the job. In the following years, Toni Morrison would go on to become the world-famous master narrator and writer that we so dearly cherish in the world of literature today. Her subsequent novels, including Beloved, would propel her to the literary recognition she so desperately deserved. And my works cited is right here. These are all of the things that I used. I did use an interview with Gail Feldman quite extensively, and Toni Morrison's biographical pages on Contemporary Literary Criticism Select and Gale Literature Contemporary Authors. They were both, all three of those sources were a wealth of knowledge. That interview with Gail Feldman, I recommend you guys checking out. I can link it to you if you have any interest. It was actually very informative and really interesting as well. So I hope you guys enjoyed the presentation. Please let me know if you have any questions. Thank you.